I paid for my brother's entire wedding, the venue, the flowers, the open bar, and when the photographer lined everyone up for the family portrait, my sister-in-law looked straight at me and said, "You're blocking the color scheme. Just step out for this one." I smiled, pulled out my phone, and texted the venue coordinator to cancel the catering deposit I had personally guaranteed. 36 hours before the ceremony. That's where the story ends, but you need to understand where it begins. My right hand had been in a brace for 6 weeks, not because I had fallen or done something careless, but because I had developed severe tendinitis from the sheer volume of work I had taken on. I'm an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the previous tax season had buried me. I had worked 70-hour weeks from February through April, eating lunch at my desk, declining every social invitation, grinding myself down to a stub of a person so that I could do 2 things: pay off my own student loans and cover the gap in my family's finances, which, if I'm being honest, had become less of a gap and more of a sinkhole. My name is not important. What's important is what I was carrying when I walked into the Magnolia Grand Event Hall on that Friday afternoon wearing a bridesmaid dress I had altered 3 times because my sister-in-law, Renee, kept changing the color. A dusty rose that washed everyone out but apparently matched her vision board perfectly. My brother's name is Wade. He is 31 years old. He has the kind of easy, gap-toothed smile that made our mother, for as long as I can remember, go soft in the eyes whenever he walked into a room. He has never held a job for longer than 14 months. He is charming and funny and completely incapable of sustained responsibility, and our parents have spent 3 decades quietly making sure no consequence ever fully landed on him. I spent those same 3 decades watching and learning that lesson. Renee had been in the picture for 2 years. She was sharp, polished, and had a way of framing every request as a compliment. "You're so organized, I knew you'd be perfect for handling the venue logistics," that kind of thing. I had coordinated the entire wedding, not as a favor, but because I was quietly asked to, because I had the credit score and the professional relationships and the ability to show up and follow through, none of which Wade possessed and none of which Renee wanted to acquire. The budget for the wedding was $42,000. My parents contributed $8,000, which represented essentially everything in their savings account. Renee's parents sent a check for $5,000 from Florida and considered that their complete involvement. Wade contributed enthusiasm and a Pinterest board. I covered the rest. I did it in pieces, the way you do when you're trying not to look too closely at the total. The venue deposit was $7,200 on my visa. The caterer required a co-signed contract because the primary booking was in Wade's name and his credit history was, in the caterer's professional assessment, insufficient. The florist was cash, which I pulled from a savings account I had been building slowly over 4 years for a down payment on a house I still did not own. I told myself it was a gift. I told myself this was what family did. I told myself that once it was over, once Wade was settled and happy, things would balance out somehow. I was 32 years old, and I still believed that doing enough would eventually be enough. The rehearsal dinner was on a Thursday evening at a restaurant in the South End called Birchwood. I had made the reservation. I had called ahead to arrange a private room and pre-select a menu because Renee had a list of dietary preferences that changed regularly. I had confirmed the head count 4 times because the guest list kept shifting. I arrived on time, which meant I arrived before nearly everyone else. My hand was aching inside the brace. I had driven myself because Wade had said he would pick me up and then sent a text at the last minute saying he and Renee were running behind and I should just grab an Uber. I grabbed an Uber. The private room was set for 14. I counted the chairs as I came in because that's the kind of person I am, the kind who counts chairs. There were exactly 14 chairs, and I recognized all of them. My parents, Wade and Renee, her parents, a set of mutual friends, the maid of honor and her husband. I was the 15th person. There was no 15th chair. I stood at the edge of the table looking at the seating arrangement Renee had clearly pre-planned, place cards and everything. There was a small card at what would have been my seat, but the chair had been replaced by a narrow, padded bench pulled from somewhere near the host's stand. It was lower than the table. It would put my eye level roughly at plate height. "Oh," Renee said, appearing behind me with a flute of champagne, her voice warm and breezy. "We had to squeeze in Laurel's husband at the last minute. Hope you don't mind the bench. You're so easygoing about stuff like this." I looked at the bench. I looked at my hand brace. I had been standing for most of the past hour. My mother, seated directly across, was watching me with an expression I had seen my entire life. It was not concern. It was a gentle, preemptive request that I not make things difficult. She tilted her head slightly in the way that meant, "Just sit down. Please don't say anything. This night matters." I sat on the bench. I sat with my knees pressed against the underside of the table because it was too high for me, and I watched the rehearsal dinner unspool around me like a film I was watching from the parking lot. Wade made a toast, and it was genuinely funny. He cried a little at the end, talking about how much he loved Renee, and it was real and I felt it too, because he is still my brother. And that part of me has never stopped working, even when everything else broke down. My father clapped him on the back. My mother dabbed her eyes. No one mentioned that I had paid for the room we were sitting in. After dinner, as people drifted toward the bar for a nightcap, Renee appeared beside me with the proprietary energy of someone who has just remembered an errand. "Can you run through the ceremony timeline with me?" she asked. Not really a question. "I want to make sure we're aligned on the vendor arrival sequence tomorrow." We stood in the hallway outside the private room for 20 minutes while she walked me through a 15-point checklist. I had written the checklist. It was, word for word, a document I had emailed her 3 weeks ago. She was reading it back to me as though it were new information. "You're seriously a lifesaver," she said at the end. "I don't know what we would have done without you." I drove home and lay in bed for a long time without sleeping, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. It was a one-bedroom in a complex I liked because it was quiet and had a good parking situation. I had been meaning to save enough to move somewhere with more natural light. That timeline had been pushed back twice now because of contributions I had made to my family's various financial shortfalls. I thought about the down payment fund. I thought about the catering contract I had co-signed. In co-signing that contract, I had agreed to be the responsible party in the event of cancellation. If the wedding was cancelled within 48 hours of the event, I owed the caterer 60% of the total bill, which was approximately $4,000. If I cancelled now at T-minus 36 hours, it was still 60%. I pushed that thought away and went to sleep. The next morning was the wedding day. I was at the venue by 9 for setup. The florist arrived at 9:15. The caterer's team came at 10 with the van. Everything proceeded along the schedule I had built, and it was working, and for a few hours I let myself feel something adjacent to pride. At 11:30, the photographer gathered the bridal party and immediate family on the grand staircase for formal portraits. Renee was luminous in her dress, genuinely, and I thought that whatever else was true about her, she had excellent taste. Wade looked better than I had ever seen him look. My parents were positioned on the second step. My father in a charcoal suit he had borrowed from a neighbor. My mother in a navy dress I had bought her at Nordstrom Rack 3 weeks ago because she had told me she didn't have anything appropriate, and I could hear in her voice that she was embarrassed about it. The photographer arranged us by height and relationship, shifting people gently by the shoulder. I was placed near the end of the third row. Then Renee's maid of honor, Jacqueline, appeared and the photographer needed to add her, and apparently the composition no longer worked with me where I was. Renee came over. She assessed the arrangement with her head tilted and one finger pressed to her lips, the gesture of someone thinking very carefully about something that, to anyone else, would seem crushingly minor. "Okay," she said. "So the color block reads Dusty Rose, Champagne, Dusty Rose, and then you've got..." She gestured at me, specifically at my dress, which was the Dusty Rose dress she had selected. "The silhouette is just a little heavy on that side. I think if you just sat out this one." We could get the clean symmetry, and honestly, the candids will be so much better for you anyway. I looked at her. I had been awake since 7. My hand was aching. I had spent the last 3 months of my life coordinating this event. I had given up my house down payment fund for this staircase. It's just the formal portraits, she said, smiling, already looking past me at the composition she was reconstructing. You're not missing anything. I smiled back. Sure, I said. Of course. I stepped out of the frame. The photographer took the portraits. I watched from 12 feet away as my family arranged themselves into a picture I was not in, and I felt something I had been avoiding feeling for a very long time. It was not hurt exactly, or not just hurt. It was the specific cold sensation of seeing something clearly for the first time and understanding that you have been choosing not to see it. I excused myself to the hallway and took out my phone. I had the venue coordinator's number saved under Magnolia Rachel. I had Rachel's number because I called her often, because I was the point of contact on this account, because my name was on the contract. I did not text her about the catering deposit yet. I put my phone away and went back inside because I needed to think. Because I had learned at some point in my adult life that the difference between a reaction and a decision is about 20 minutes and a glass of water. I went to find my father. He was standing near the coat check, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, looking out the tall windows at the garden where the ceremony would take place. He and I have always had a quieter relationship than he has with Wade. Not a worse one, just quieter. He is the kind of man who watches more than he speaks, which I've always respected and which has also allowed him to witness things without intervening in them for 30 years. Dad, I said, standing next to him at the window, did you know that Wade and Renee borrowed against the joint emergency account? He turned to look at me slowly. What joint account? 3 years ago, when my father had a health scare and a regular heartbeat that turned out to be manageable but had scared all of us badly for about 2 weeks, I had opened a joint account with him specifically for medical emergencies. I had been putting $400 a month into it. I had not told my mother because I did not want her to feel beholden, and I had not told Wade because I knew, with the confidence of someone who had been burned before, what would happen if Wade knew about a pool of money. I had been meaning to check the balance. I had not checked it recently because everything had been focused on the wedding. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app in front of my father. The account that should have held approximately $14,000 held $217. My father's face did something complicated. Wade said he'd pay it back before you noticed, he said quietly. He said he needed it for the venue deposit. I had paid the venue deposit. When did he take it? I asked. A few months back. I thought you knew. I had not known. My father had known for months and had said nothing because I understood this without him saying it. Because telling me would have meant a confrontation, and confrontation was something our family had built an elaborate architecture to avoid. I closed the banking app. I put my phone back in my pocket. I took a breath. How much did he take? I said. I'm not sure of the exact number. He looked at the garden. Most of it, I think. I walked back through the reception hall, past the tables I had helped select, under the floral installations I had coordinated with the florist, and I went to the bridal suite where Renee was having her makeup touched up, and Wade was standing in the corner playing something on his phone. Hey, I said, closing the door behind me. I kept my voice neutral and even, the same voice I use when I'm telling a client there's a discrepancy in their quarterly numbers. I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Wade looked up. Something in my tone registered because his posture shifted slightly. Renee's makeup artist continued working. The joint account, I said. Dad's emergency account, I just looked at it. Wade put his phone in his pocket. He had the good sense not to pretend he didn't know what I was talking about. I was going to pay it back, he said. It was a loan. You didn't ask me. I knew you'd say no. So you took it anyway. We needed it, he said, and he said it in the tone he has used his entire life, the tone that has always worked on my mother which is a tone that combines mild defensiveness with the implicit suggestion that he is the one being wronged by this conversation. The wedding was more expensive than we planned, and I didn't want to stress anyone out by asking. Wade. I paused. I paid the venue deposit. What did you need the money for? He looked at Renee. Renee's eyes flicked to him in the mirror. We upgraded the honeymoon package, Renee said, her voice light, as though this were the most natural sentence in the world. Bali was just a standard resort. We moved to the private villa tier. It made more sense for what we wanted. I stood there for a moment. They had taken $14,000 from my father's medical emergency fund to upgrade their honeymoon. I thought about the photographer's staircase. I thought about the rehearsal dinner bench. I thought about my mother's navy dress and the reason she'd needed me to buy it. I thought about the house I did not own and the savings account I'd poured into someone else's life for years. Okay, I said. I walked out of the bridal suite. I walked down the corridor to the event coordinator's station where Rachel was running through the final pre-ceremony checklist. She was efficient and calm, and I had always liked working with her. Rachel, I said, I need to make a change to the catering contract. She looked up from her clipboard. I need to remove myself as co-guarantor, I said. The primary party is Wade Harlan. Going forward, all financial responsibility should revert to him. Rachel's expression was professionally neutral. I can process that, she said, but I'll need his signature on the amendment, and the original co-guarantor remains liable for anything incurred prior to. I understand, I said. I also need to discuss the deposit I placed on the private garden extension for the reception hour. I had paid separately, out of pocket, for an additional garden hour that Renee had requested in February. It was $1,100. It was non-refundable. I made the call. I had Rachel adjust what could be adjusted. I was meticulous about it because I am always meticulous. Because that is the quality that got me into this situation, and it is also the quality that was going to get me out. Then I did one more thing. I went to the table near the guest book where I had left my bag, and I retrieved the small white envelope I had placed inside it that morning. Inside the envelope was a card I had written the night before the rehearsal dinner, at about midnight, in the particular quiet of someone who has been running calculations for hours. The card said, "Wishing you both exactly what you've built together," and inside the card was a personal check for $3,000, which had been my planned wedding gift. I put the envelope back in my bag. Then I straightened my dusty rose dress and walked into the ceremony because Wade was still my brother, and I was not going to blow up his wedding in a corridor. I had been precise. I had been quiet. And now I was going to sit in the fourth row and watch him get married and let the afternoon proceed. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that weddings almost always are, regardless of everything surrounding them, because there is something about two people choosing each other in front of witnesses that resists cynicism. I cried a little, which I had not expected. Wade cried more. When he cried, he looked about 12 years old, and I remembered suddenly a specific afternoon when we were children and he had crashed his bike into a fence, and I had walked him home and cleaned the gravel out of his palms and told him it didn't even look that bad. I held on to that memory through the reception. I danced once with my father, who held my braced hand very carefully and didn't say anything about the account, and I was grateful for that. I ate the meal I had helped plan. I gave a toast that I had written 3 weeks ago before the rehearsal dinner, before the bench, before the staircase, before the banking app. It was a good toast. People laughed in the right places. Renee thanked me in front of everyone as the maid of honor toast was wrapping up. I couldn't have done any of this without her, she said, gesturing to me from the microphone. She is the most organized, giving person I know. The room applauded. I smiled and raised my glass. The next morning, I sent Wade a text. No preamble, no softening language, just the facts arranged in a list. I told him I had seen the account balance. I told him I knew about the honeymoon upgrade. I told him I had removed myself as co-guarantor on the catering contract, which meant any outstanding balance from the reception would be billed directly to him. I told him the card I had planned to give him would not be coming, and that the $3,000 I had set aside for it was instead going back into the account he had emptied as the first installment of the repayment I expected. I told him I was not angry in the way that I might have been once. I told him I was tired in a way that was actually clarifying, the way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally put it down on the ground and feel the true weight of it for the first time. I told him that I loved him and that I would always love him, but that I was no longer available to be the financial floor beneath his life. He did not respond for 4 days. When he did respond, it was a long message, and it went through several stages: denial, then minimization, then a version of the story in which I had always been difficult and hard to reach emotionally, and this had put pressure on him and Renee in ways I probably didn't appreciate. There was a section in which Renee had clearly contributed language. I could tell by the sentence structure. At the bottom of the message, below everything else, was one line that was just him. I know you're right. I don't know how to fix this yet, but I know you're right. I sat with that for a while. My mother called me 2 weeks after the wedding. She had heard, through my father, something of what had happened, and she had the particular, careful energy of someone who wants to mediate without taking a position. She asked how I was doing. She asked how I was doing. She asked if I was eating. She told me she thought I might owe Renee an apology for making the reception feel tense. I asked my mother gently if she had known about the emergency account. There was a pause. I knew he borrowed some of it, she said. I thought it was just a couple thousand. It was nearly all of it, Mum. Another pause. He said he'd pay it back. I heard in her voice the same thing I'd heard my entire life, the gentle, endless renegotiation that happened every time Wade did something that should have had consequences. The soft landing my parents had spent 30 years manufacturing for him. I know he said that, I said. He always says that. I didn't say anything else about it. I didn't need her to agree with me or validate me or apologize on his behalf. I was 32 years old. I did not need my mother to tell me that what had happened was wrong. I had already decided that on my own, quietly, standing outside a family portrait in a dress I had bought 3 times over. 6 weeks after the wedding, I met my brother for coffee. I chose a place near my office. Neutral ground, public. A coffee shop I liked because it had good light and the tables were far enough apart to have a real conversation without being overheard. He was there when I arrived, which surprised me. Wade has historically been late to everything. He was sitting with his hands around a mug, and he looked tired in a way I had not seen on him before, a real tired. Not the performed fatigue of someone avoiding effort, but the tired of someone who has been thinking hard. He had started talking to someone, he said, a therapist. It was his 3rd session. He said it quietly, like he was still deciding whether to be embarrassed about it. I said that was good. I meant it. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check for $600. It's not the whole thing, he said. Obviously. But it's real. I got a second job, server position at a place downtown, Wednesday through Saturday nights. He looked at his coffee. Renee's not thrilled. But you're doing it anyway, I said. I'm doing it anyway, he said. I took the check and put it in my bag, and he watched me do it with an expression I recognized because I had seen a version of it in the mirror recently. It was the expression of someone who has spent a long time being treated as though accountability was optional and is now experiencing the discomfort of discovering that it isn't and finding underneath that discomfort something that might eventually become self-respect. We talked for an hour. We talked about his job and my job and the coffee shop's parking situation, which was genuinely terrible, and whether our father's knee was going to need the surgery the doctor had mentioned. We did not resolve everything because there is no resolution available that would undo the years of it, the pattern of it, the specific cost of being the one who was always capable enough to handle things and therefore always asked to. But I walked out of that coffee shop into a sharp October afternoon, and I felt the difference. I was not the bank. I was not the coordinator, the guarantor, the problem solver, the one who sat on the bench and smiled and made it easy. I was just myself, walking to my car with a check in my bag that was real money earned by my brother's own hands. I had spent 3 decades setting a seat at a table for people who never saved one for me. Now I was building a different table entirely, and every chair at it was mine. I keep coming back to that staircase. Not the moment Renee asked me to step out of the frame, though that was the moment everything cracked open, but the seconds right after, when I walked those 12 feet away and stood there in my dusty rose dress, watching my family arrange themselves into a picture without me. I wasn't invisible. I was right there. They just chose not to see me, and the difference between those two things took me 32 years to understand. What I've learned is that the things we enable don't stay the same size. They grow. Every time I covered a bill without saying anything, every time I absorbed a consequence that belonged to someone else, I wasn't being generous. I was teaching everyone around me that there was no flaw, that I would keep going down to meet them wherever they fell. Wade didn't steal from that emergency account because he was malicious. He did it because nothing in his life had ever suggested he shouldn't. That's not cruelty. That's the slow, accumulated result of never once being held to account, and I had been part of building that system for as long as he had. That realization wasn't comfortable. It required a kind of honesty I had been avoiding because it implicated me too. It's easier to be the wronged party than to ask what role you played in writing the story. I had played the capable one for so long that I had made myself indispensable, and somewhere along the way I had confused indispensability with belonging. They are not the same thing. One is a function, the other is a feeling. I had been performing a function and calling it love. What changed wasn't my anger. Anger I've had for years. What changed was my clarity. The morning after the wedding, when I typed out that message to Wade, just the facts, no performance, no softening, I felt something. I felt something I can only describe as the return of my own judgment. I had spent so long second-guessing my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive, too calculating, too cold, that I had outsourced my own sense of what was real. Getting it back felt less like triumph and more like standing up straight after years of bracing. The check Wade brought to that coffee shop 6 weeks later was for $600. It was not enough. It was not the point. The point was that he had earned it at a second job his wife disapproved of, and he had handed it to me anyway. That small, real act of follow-through told me more about who he might become than 3 years of promises had. I took the check because taking it was the honest thing to do. Refusing it would have been its own kind of condescension, another way of protecting him from the weight of what he owed. Integrity, I'd decided, is not the single dramatic moment. It's the accumulation of smaller decisions made when no one is watching and nothing is certain. It's cancelling the contract and then still showing up for the ceremony because both things can be true. It's telling your father quietly at a window that you saw the account balance, not to wound him, but because facts are facts and pretending otherwise helps no one. It's taking the $600 and saying, next installment when you can. I don't know exactly how the rest of this goes. Wade is in therapy. My father's knee may need surgery. My mother and I talk on the phone every couple of weeks in the careful way of two people who love each other and are still working out the terms. I am saving again, slowly toward a house with better light. What I know is this. I spent years believing that if I gave enough, eventually someone would save me a seat. Nobody saved me a seat. So I stopped waiting and started building the table myself. That turns out to be the only version of this story with a decent ending.